Before I introduce this afternoon's Grand Round speakers, I would like to make an announcement that this is the second from our last Grand Rounds. We will have one more, and then we take a break for the summer, so there will be no Grand Round scheduled for June, July, and August, and we'll resume again in September. With that item out of the way, let me go ahead and welcome and introduce our Grand Round speaker for this afternoon. And he is Dr. Noel Card, who currently is an assistant professor in the Division of Family Studies and Human Development at the U of A Norton School of Family and Consumer Sciences. Dr. Card received his BS in biochemistry and BA degree in psychology from Michigan State University. He then went on to St. John's University to complete his master's and his PhD in clinical psychology. From 2004 to 2006, Dr. Card completed a fellowship at the University of Kansas. Dr. Card serves on the editorial board for Child Development, the Journal of Research on Adolescence, and the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. He's also the chair of the Adolescent Health and Development Initiative at the McClellan Institute for Children, Youth, and Families. His interests are in both social development and quantitative methods, and especially at the interface of these two disciplines. His substantive research is in social development, especially peer relationships and aggressive behavior during childhood and adolescence. He is conducting research that considers the various forms and functions of aggressive behavior, the risk factors, and consequences of childhood childhood peer victimization, and the dyadic relationships that exist between aggressor and victim. Dr. Card has nothing to disclose that would represent a conflict of interest related to today's presentation, entitled "Move Over Mean Girls, Boys Can Be Socially Aggressive Too." I never knew that, but...
Well, thank you for that. And also thanks for all of you who are attending, including here live and via the telecommunications. And finally, I want to thank Amy for inviting me and helping me organize all of this. Now, I want to explain the lengthy title here. Amy invited me based on a press release for a article I had published recently, and the press release was titled "Move Over Mean Girls, Boys Can Be Aggressive Too." Now, that's pretty catchy, but I wanted to give a little bit more, dry, if you will, title of various forms and functions of aggression during childhood and adolescence. Now, the reason for this alternative title is I do want to talk more broadly about aggression and victimization during childhood and adolescence than merely about that article. I'll begin by focusing on that article, and we can certainly talk about that one as long as we'd like, but I'd like to move beyond that to think more broadly about aggressive behavior, because I think that broader thinking does have some implications both for research and intervention. Now, specifically today, I want to let me first start by encouraging any of you, if along the way you have any questions or comments, do feel free to interrupt me. I'm pretty flexible in terms of how quickly or slowly we go through this, and that includes also others who are watching off-site. My plan today is to talk about these topics here. I want to begin with a broader overview about the importance of studying, and I put parenthetically about reducing or intervening in aggressive behavior during childhood and adolescence. From there, I want to dive into the meta-analysis that was the impetus for this invitation in the first title, which involves the overt and relational forms of aggressive behavior. And specifically, I want to give you results of a meta-analysis that involves the magnitude of gender differences in these two forms of aggression, the extent to which these two forms overlap. Is it the case that children or adolescents who engage in one form very often tend to engage in the other form? And I also want to provide some evidence about what I call the differential correlates of these two forms. To what extent are these two forms related to various aspects of psychosocial adjustment or maladjustment? From there, I want to present a different meta-analysis, but one I think that is related, that divvies up aggression not by the forms that it takes, but rather by the functions that it serves. And this meta-analysis will focus on the proactive versus reactive distinction. And here I want to focus on the extent to which these two functions are overlapping, as well as the extent to which these two functions are related to different aspects of maladjustment. From there, I want to conclude with some limitations and future directions, and to have what I guess would be a me-led, if you will, but hopefully with a lot of participation, but some discussion about some of the implications for this research for either future research on prevention or intervention or actual applications in prevention and intervention. Okay. So let me start very broadly, first by talking about the prevalence of aggressive behavior. So why should we even study aggression? Well, case number one is that these are very prevalent behaviors. So if we look at across hundreds of studies, many different countries, we find that aggressors, children and adolescents who are classified as regularly engaging in aggression include anywhere from 10 to 20%. Okay? Now, when we look at victims, it's similarly about 10 to 20%. There also exists this smaller group of kids who both engage in aggression and are the recipients of aggression or the victimization. They're a little bit smaller, but still comprise about 5 to 10% of the total population. Now, if you look at these prevalences, maybe it doesn't seem overwhelmingly prevalent. Okay, it's not the case that all kids or even sometimes the majority of kids are involved in aggression. But if we contrast that to some of the prevalence rates of the more commonly studied problems, if you will, psychopathologies in childhood and adolescence, the aggression is certainly a common problem relative to a lot of those prevalences. I'd also like to point out that among the not-involved, the so-called non-involved kids, which comprise about 50 to 75% of children and adolescents, these uninvolved kids also play some role, oftentimes, in aggressive occurrences. Either they act as direct assistants to aggressors, or sometimes supporters merely by cheering on or merely watching aggressive instances. Or alternatively, they can act as defenders of the victims. So there are a small but substantial portion of kids which will actively stick up and try to defend victims. Okay, so these uninvolved kids are not as uninvolved as we might expect. So aggression is prevalent, and there's also a lot of negative consequences associated with this. And I'm going to talk in more detail about some of these when I get to the meta-analyses. But some of the immediate consequences for the aggressors, the kids that are enacting the aggression, while they tend to be rejected by their normative peers tend to not like them and actively dislike them. What that means is, if they want to have friends, they want to affiliate with other kids, as most children do, the kids that are going to be left for them are other deviant peers. And as they begin to affiliate with these other deviant peers, what goes on is there's often a reinforcement and training effect where the other deviant peers not only reinforce their already occurring aggression, but will help them expand their repertoire into other deviant behaviors, okay? Other forms of delinquency, substance use, etc. And finally, the immediate consequences for these aggressors is they tend to be disengaged from school. Now, part of this is involuntary. They're more often suspended from school, but it's also partly voluntary. On average, aggressive kids tend to be less interested in school. And as you can expect, this is going to have longer-term consequences for them. Some of these long-term consequences include poor interpersonal relationships, things like spousal abuse during adulthood, tend to be more likely to abuse or use substances during adulthood. They tend to be unemployed or underemployed, and they're more likely to have criminal activity, their histories of criminal activity. Now, this sounds quite gloomy and grim, and I certainly would not want to imply that all aggressive children are going to become delinquent adolescents and ultimately criminal adults, but they are more likely. Okay? And so one of the questions we can think about is why is it the case that some of these aggressive children are likely to go on to have more problematic adult lives than are others? And when I get to the forms and functions, I hope to be able to speak to that a little bit. Now, before I turn to these specific forms and functions of aggression, I do want to point out that there's, as you might expect, a lot of negative consequences for victims. Some of the immediate consequences include a variety of internalizing problems. They tend to suffer higher rates of anxiety, depression, withdrawn behavior, and some evidence suggesting that they're more likely to have suicidal thoughts and, in some cases, even actions. There's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence that of youth who commit suicide often being victimized. Victimized kids often have unexplained somatic problems, headaches, stomach aches, etc. They're also, like the aggressors, tend to be disengaged from school. Here the process seems to be primarily that they're fearful of school and they want to actively avoid school, which sort of makes sense. We can imagine that if we were in a workplace where we're chronically abused, we would probably want to avoid that if we had the option. And finally, I put this up with some hesitancy. The last immediate consequence is weapon carrying. Now, I'll point out primarily the evidence for this comes from these cases such as the Columbine shooting of a little more than 10 years ago. But there is some early empirical evidence that kids who are victimized are more likely to have social cognitions or thoughts that favor weapon carrying in school. And there's even some small, quite small at this point, but some small links to actual in-school weapon carrying. Okay? Now, again, the evidence surrounding the link between victimization and weapon carrying is very much in its infancy, but I think there is enough there to say, at least preliminarily, it looks like there is this link, which confirms a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we've heard. Now, some of the consequences for victims long-term, we don't know as much as we do about aggressors. We haven't studied the victims nearly as long as we've studied the aggressors. But what long-term prospective studies we do have suggests is that these victims also have poor interpersonal relationships during adulthood. Primarily what we see here is that they tend to be shy, very shy during early adulthood about making friendships, romantic relationships, and they're more often to have experience loneliness during adulthood. There's also long-term, as much as 10, 15 years later, long-term predictive links between victimization and having low self-concept, some internalizing problems, specifically depression. I don't know if it's been connected to some of the other internalizing problems, but definitely depression. So there is this evidence that there are also long-term consequences of victimization. Now again, I wouldn't want to imply that every person who's victimized as a child is going to go on to have these problems during adulthood, but again, there are these probabilistic links. Okay. Now finally, in terms of why should we study aggression, I would argue that there's negative consequences not only for the aggressors and victims, but for all kids who are around this aggressive behavior. When we do surveys asking kids, what are some of the worries that you have? Okay, so kind of the low-grade anxieties. Invariably, being victimized, being bullied is one of the worries that appears near the top of the list in these sort of surveys. So this, to me, provides evidence that even kids who are not being victimized, or maybe not even engaging in aggression, are still concerned about bullying behavior. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. Including those who are watching via televideo? Well, from here on I think I made this conclusion that if I'm going to make the final case for why we should study and think about aggression, it's common and it has negative consequences for all involved. I think that's pretty compelling evidence that we should study this. Let me dive into how we can study this now by presenting the two meta-analyses my colleagues and I have published in the last few years. The first of these is going to involve the forms of aggression. Now, when I talk about this form distinction, aggression has primarily been distinguished along the lines of two forms. The first is what we probably commonly think about when we think of aggressive behavior, what we now call the overt forms of aggression. Now, other terms for this include direct aggression. Some people call it simply physical and verbal aggression. But these are very much in-your-face, physically and verbally aggressive behavior that are directly applied to the victim. Things like pushing a kid, hitting a kid, calling that kid a name to their face. These are what we consider the overt forms of aggression. And this is what we most commonly consider and what researchers exclusively considered up until about the 1980s or so, late 1980s, I think, was when people first started considering this other form, if you will, which I'm going to call relational aggression. Now, people use a lot of different terms for this relational aggression, including social aggression, indirect aggression, covert aggression. Now, there are those that will argue that there's these subtle differences between these forms, but when we look at things like factor analysis studies, these all kind of go together into this one form, which I'm going to call relational aggression. What this form of aggression involved is behaviors that are aimed at damaging a victim's social relationships, and they're often used through kind of covert, behind-the-back sort of means. So this might involve behaviors such as gossiping and rumor spreading, hurtful manipulation of friendships, so I won't be your friend unless you do this, or I'm going to try to steal away your friend. And it also carries over into romantic relationships. So during adolescence, we see oftentimes girls and boys, I'm going to argue, attempting to steal boyfriends or girlfriends, not just out of attraction, but in an intentionally hurtful manner. Okay, and these all fall under this rubric of relational aggression. Okay. Now, for the meta-analytic review, we tried to address 4 general questions. First, we wanted to ask questions about gender differences in relational aggression. Now, a lot of people have done meta-analyses about gender differences in overt aggression, and consistently these have found that there is an effect where boys enact more overt aggression than girls. Probably not a big surprise, right? Well, the prevailing view on gender differences in relational aggression has been that girls enact more of this relational aggression than boys. We look at some of the popular media, the movie Mean Girls, for instance. It's these girls enacting these relational forms of aggression. My colleagues and I, as we were sort of informally reading the literature, started to doubt how large that effect was, or even if that effect was there. So we wanted to examine whether there were indeed gender differences in relational aggression. The second goal of this review was to evaluate how strong do these 2 forms of aggression overlap. Now, a pretty casual reading of the literature suggests that they are indeed positively correlated. So kids that enact one form of aggression tend to enact the other forms of aggression. Well, how large is that overlap? Is it fairly modest, so it's very reasonable that many kids would enact one form or the other? Or is it approaching a perfect association, which would suggest that there's really no reason to separate these aggression by forms? The third question or goal we had was to explore, and I think this is potentially the most interesting question, we wanted to explore the differential associations these 2 forms have with maladjustment. In other words, is it the case that one form of aggression or the other is more strongly associated with maladjustment? The literature was really inconsistent in this regard, so it was a pretty unexplored question before this review. And lastly, we wanted to examine whether there were gender differences in the links to maladjustment. So specifically, technically speaking, is there gender moderation in the associations between these forms of aggression with maladjustment? Put in more comprehensible terms, is it the case that aggression is more strongly correlated with maladjustment for boys or girls? Okay? And does that potentially differ by forms? One of the hypotheses that had been put forth in the field was what was called the gender non-normative hypothesis. And this hypothesis briefly went as such. Boys who enact relational forms of aggression, which is gender non-normative, I'm doing the air quotes for those of you who can't see me, or for that matter, girls who enact overt aggression, that would be considered gender non-normative. And the hypothesis was that this gender non-normative forms of aggression would be more strongly linked to maladjustment. Okay. Well, a little bit about the method. I won't bore you too much with the details of the methodology unless you want to talk about that, but we included in this meta-analysis 148 studies, which consisted of over 73,000 kids. I point that out. We had really high statistical power for some of our analyses. And we did a lot of the traditional meta-analytic ways of finding literature through computerized searches, what are called forward and backward searches. We included both published and unpublished studies in order to reduce or eliminate any potential for publication bias. And I'll point out that the studies we included were limited just to those that included samples less than the age of 18 years. So we're really focusing on childhood and adolescence. I'm going to just leave the effect size and analysis up there if anyone wants to ask questions about it. We use fairly traditional indices of effect sizes, except where I'll note in a couple of minutes we did correct effect sizes for some methodological features that tend to attenuate those in the literature. And we use something called a random effects model, which allows for greater generalizability beyond this sample of effect sizes. Okay? I also teach statistics, by the way. So in terms of the first question, gender differences, as we expected, as several previous reviews have shown, boys enact overt aggression more than girls. I do want to point out, however, that the effect size that we found is considered medium by traditional rules of thumb. So the reason I point this out is we do not want to make the mistake of thinking that girls do not enact overt aggression. They do. Now, they don't do so as much as boys, but we would not want to consider girls as not being overtly aggressive. In terms of the relational aggression, we concluded that girls and boys enact virtually identical amounts of relational aggression. Now, to be fair, it was a statistically significant effect size, correlation of 0.03 favoring girls enacting more indirect or relational aggression than boys. But, again, remember that sample size thing of effective sample size in the tens of thousands? We had a lot of statistical power. When we look at the practical significance of this effect size, first, if we compare it to rules of thumb that are common in the social sciences, generally we consider correlation coefficients of plus or minus 0.10 as being small, while this is a 0.03. Okay? What do we call that? Really, really small. Variance explained. If we take that 0.03 and square it, that tells us how much of the variance in the occurrence of relational aggression is accounted for by gender. And the amount is 0.09%, or roughly 1/10 of 1%. Okay? I'm arguing that that's small and trivial. Okay? And in other words, it certainly would be a huge mistake, I think, to assume that it's only girls enacting relational aggression. I argue that for all practical purposes, boys and girls are identical in the amount of relational aggression they enact. Okay, and this contrasts a lot of what previous researchers had argued, as well as how relational aggression is portrayed in the popular media. Okay. Now, for the second question, the correlations between forms, I'll be a little briefer here. We found what we call a disattenuated or true latent correlation between the overt and relational forms of 0.76. If you recall, correlations can range from 0, which is a completely unrelated, to 1, which is a perfect overlap. This is certainly a very strong correlation by anyone's standards. But at the same time, I will point out that a correlation of 0.76 implies that 58% of the variance in these two forms overlaps. That's huge by most standards. But at the same time, 42% of the variance in the occurrence of each of these forms of regression is unique or non-overlapping. Okay? Now, what this suggests potentially is that these two forms, even if they're highly overlapping, it often is the case that if a kid's enacting one form, they're using the other as well. But even though they're highly overlapping, there's enough room that there may be some meaningful differences between these two forms. And that takes me to the third question, where we looked at the associations that these two forms of regression have with maladjustment. Now, we chose 6 indices, 6 admittedly broad indices of maladjustment for a couple reasons. First, pragmatically, these are some of the common indices that are looked at in the literature, and since a meta-analysis relies on the literature, this is what we had enough evidence to work with. But at the same time, these six aspects really cover a fairly wide range of psychological adjustment with the first 3. So internalizing problems and then emotional dysregulation / ADHD type symptoms, which I know psychiatrists are not going to like that kind of classification, but fairly broad classification there, as well as delinquency. Those can all be considered psychological or psychiatric, subclinical psychiatric problems. Prosocial behaviors would be an index of socially competent behavior. And then the last 2 would get at the quality of relationships that these potentially aggressive kids would have with their peers. Peer acceptance indexes how well liked kids are, okay? And peer rejection indexes how disliked kids are. And those are not necessarily opposite ends of the same continuum, okay? Now, if we turn to these results, let me first look at show you the bivariate correlations. What I've presented up here are for each of the 6 indices of maladjustment. The K is the number of studies that have looked at this association. The bivariate correlations are the simple bivariate correlations of overt and relational aggression with each of those 6 indices of maladjustment. Now, if you look at these bivariate correlations, it looks like overt and relational aggression are pretty similarly related to maladjustment. But if you remember, again, overt and relational aggression are highly overlapping. And when we have 2 highly overlapping constructs and we want to see how they uniquely relate to a dependent variable or an aspect of maladjustment, we often rely on semi-partial correlations, which I presented here in this column for overt aggression, here in this column for relational aggression. And we also computed this differential statistic D, which is a fairly kind of obscure effect size that we created based on some old work that Jack Cohen had done. I won't talk about that so much other than to simply point out that this tests whether there's a significant difference between the association of one form of aggression versus the other with the index of maladjustment. They were all significant, which indicates that the results I'm going to show you right here are all significantly different in terms of one form being more strongly related than the other. Okay? Now, if we start with overt aggression, we see that the overt aggression is consistently related to maladjustment. Specifically, it's positively related to emotional dysregulation and ADHD type symptoms, not necessarily formal ADHD diagnosis. As you might expect, it's positively and uniquely related to delinquency. It's negatively related to pro-social behavior. Kids who are more overtly aggressive tend to enact lower levels of pro-social behavior. And it's related to peer relations, as you might expect. Kids who are overtly aggressive tend to be less accepted by peers and fairly highly rejected by their peers or disliked by their peers. Now, in contrast, we see less consistent associations with maladjustment for relationally aggressive kids. They do tend to have a small tendency to have more internalizing problems. And again, this is a broad category that includes studies that looked at depression, anxiety problems, and social withdrawal. And there is also a unique relation of relational aggression tend to be uniquely related to higher rates of delinquency. And when I say unique relation, I mean even after you account for or control for a child's level of overt aggression, the level of that child's relational aggression is still uniquely predictive of delinquent behavior, above and beyond overt aggression. Okay? So relational aggression is indeed related to maladjustment, but certainly not as strongly or not as consistently as is overt aggression. Okay? I do want to point out, interesting, I think, finding is that relational aggression is uniquely related to high levels of pro-social behavior. Okay? So this is actually suggesting that relational aggression is related to an aspect of positive adjustment. Well, as we think about this, this makes sense. To enact gossiping, rumor spreading, manipulating friendships, a child certainly has to have a certain level of social skills, which is reflected in their ability to enact pro-social behavior, at least when it's useful for them. That last comment, the at least when it's useful for them, is more speculative rather than based on empirical reasoning, but that was our explanation for this finding. Okay? Okay. The last, or some conclusions, the last question to point out about these forms that we looked at in the meta-analysis involves potential gender differences in the associations with maladjustment. I can summarize that very easily. There was not in any one instance any evidence that gender moderates the associations between these two forms of aggression and maladjustment. In other words, if overt aggression is related to high levels of delinquency, that relation is exactly equal for boys and girls. Okay? And I am making a strong statement for a null finding, but at the same time, remember, we had an incredible amount of statistical power for these analyses. And so if I didn't find it in these analyses, I'm pretty convinced that it doesn't exist, at least in any kind of meaningful magnitude. Okay? So the long and short of it is overt and relational aggression is related to maladjustment for both boys and girls. Okay? So a few conclusions to draw from this meta-analysis. I would say it's clearly important to consider both forms. Okay? They are largely overlapping, but it's by no means a perfect overlap. And if we were going to try to figure out a child and some of the problems that that child is having, we would be remiss if we only looked at one form or the other. Okay? We would be lacking, I think, if we only asked about overt aggression and missed relational aggression. There were some different associations with maladjustment. Now, admittedly, the pattern was much more consistent for overt aggression, but there were some unique relations for relational aggression. So it would be important to understand whether a child is engaging in both forms, one form or the other, to understand some of the potential correlated maladjustment that that child may be experiencing. The last conclusion I want to have really gets at that the catchy title of my talk, the Move Over Mean Girls. I think, and this is why I think it was important for that press release to go out and for it to get attention. I think we really need to avoid gender absolute conclusions about aggressive behavior. Okay? Even for overt aggression, where there were, as with other previous reviews, there were gender differences, these are modest. So let's not fall into the dichotomous thinking that it's only boys enacting overt aggression. And certainly we have no evidence to go with the flip side of thinking, that it's primarily, certainly not only, or even that it's primarily girls who are enacting the relational aggression. Okay? And finally, there really are no gender differences that are large enough for us to detect in terms of how these two forms of aggression are related to maladjustment. Okay? So this field of looking at relational aggression was originally, historically, largely motivated by bringing gender equity to the field of aggression, avoiding attention only to boys, bringing attention only to girls. I think that emergence has been important in drawing attention to relational aggression, but I think we need to not adhere very closely, if at all, to gender categorization, that thinking that boys and girls enact one form or the other. Okay? Really very minimal, if any, overlap between gender and the type of aggression enacted. Okay. Any thoughts or comments about this part of my talk, the forms of aggression? Okay. Including anyone who's calling in, Keno folks or anyone else? Okay. Well, then I'm going to just keep on talking. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about some of the functions of aggression. So I started by talking broadly, here's this thing called aggression, here's why it's a problem. I then subdivided it by the forms that the aggression takes, specifically dividing it into the overt forms, such as physical pushing and things like that, and direct verbal name-calling, versus the indirect or relational forms. Now I want to go back to that aggression construct, but dissect it in a little bit different way. Here I want to focus on the functions that the aggression is likely to serve. And the common distinction that is made in this field is between proactive aggression and reactive aggression. Now, proactive aggression is sometimes called instrumental or cold-blooded aggression. I actually don't like the term cold-blooded aggression, but it has been used. This is aggression enacted to obtain some kind of tangible reward, to get something. Now, in contrast, reactive aggression is aggression that's usually enacted along with angry affect, but it's aggression enacted to some kind of perceived threat. Okay? So we can all get a picture, I think, of proactive aggression versus reactive aggression in our mind. Proactive aggression is the school bully who's shaking another kid down for the lunch money. Reactive aggression is a kid where something happens, they spaz out, and they behave aggressively. Okay? The reason this distinction is important, I think for our purposes, is that there's distinct social cognitions linked to each of these functions of aggression. So one model of social cognitions that have been used to explain aggressive behavior is Crick and Dodge's social information processing model, which posits 6 steps that occur between stimuli and response that might be used to explain aggressive behavior. These social cognitions have fallen out, and there's a lot of empirical evidence to support this, that reactive aggression is primarily caused by biases or deficits in terms of encoding cues or interpreting cues. Reactively aggressive kids tend to take in less of the cues that exist in their world, and when they interpret those cues, they're more likely to interpret others' behaviors as being hostile in intent. What's sometimes called a hostile attribution bias. Now, in contrast, proactively aggressive kids are believed to have biases or deficits in terms of accessing or constructing responses or in deciding in which responses they want to enact. So in other words, proactively aggressive kids are likely to think about what is it that I want to have, what's a good way to get it? Well, being aggressive is a good way to get it. Okay? So I point out those social cognitions because if we're going to intervene at the cognitive level, I think that understanding the different underlying social cognitions that support proactive and reactive aggression is useful. Now, in this review, which parallels some of the goals of the first one, minus the gender differences, it was a much smaller review of only 42 studies, but still over 20,000 as the effective sample size. Very similar methodology, still limited to children and adolescents under the age of 18. We tried to address two questions here. First, how strongly overlapping or correlated are these two functions of aggression, and are they differentially related to maladjustment? Okay, so I'll go through these results because it's very similar to the previous meta-analysis a little bit more quickly. First, as with overt and relational forms, proactive and reactive functions of aggression are highly correlated. And this is pretty consistent across the method used to measure aggression across age. Now, despite this high correlation, we were able to find some distinct associations with maladjustment. And again, that D statistic simply lets you know that these were statistically significant differences. Specifically, reactive aggression for every one of the 8 indices we looked at, and I'll point out we looked at very similar indices as in the previous meta-analysis, internalizing problems, 2 types of externalizing problems, pro-social behavior. We broke up this peer relations of peer acceptance and peer rejection also into a construct called social preference, which is simply an aggregate of peer acceptance and peer rejection. We did that simply because there was fewer studies to look at and we wanted to try to include all that we could. And lastly, in terms of the correlates, the last one listed there is peer victimization. We also wanted to look at the extent to which engaging in these 2 functions of aggression is related to kids themselves being the victims of aggressive behavior. What we see is that with reactive aggression, there's consistent relations with maladjustment across the board, across all 8 of these indices we looked at. And they're in the expectable direction. Reactive aggression is related to internalizing problems, externalizing problems. Note that it's especially related to emotional dysregulation and ADHD symptoms. Probably not surprising if you have a good picture of a reactively aggressive kid in your mind. Lower pro-social behavior, poorer peer relations, and also that reactive aggression is related to kids themselves being victimized. Okay? Some have speculated that these reactively aggressive kids kind of start things that they aren't necessarily, I hate to use the terms, but they aren't ready to finish. Basically, they get emotionally dysregulated, flustered, they get into a fight, and they lose. Okay? So they're more likely to be victimized. Okay? Now, these proactive aggression kids, I certainly don't want to portray them as getting off scot-free, if you will. They do suffer maladjustment, especially in the forms of delinquency, and they are rejected or disliked by mainstream peers. But aside from that, the unique relations between proactive aggression and maladjustment are nowhere near as consistent or strong as they are for reactive aggression. Okay, so if I was going to pick who I would want to be, well, certainly I wouldn't want to be an aggressive kid to start with, but if I had to be a proactive versus reactively aggressive kid, presumably you're less worse off if you're a proactively aggressive kid than a reactively aggressive kid. Okay? So a few conclusions which I've already kind of summarized. So why is this important? Well, there's these different underlying social cognitions that might be a focus point for treatment. The 2 functions are largely overlapping, but they are differentially associated with maladjustment in ways that I've just described. Okay. Now, in the interest of time, I do want to be a little bit quicker, but I do want to point out some of the limitations to this research, both the field of research as a whole, as well as these particular meta-analyses, as well as, I don't like to think of them as limitations, I like to think of them as where we need to go next, or future directions. In terms of future directions, I think one of the important ones is to bring together these two ways of dissecting aggression that I presented into a more unified framework. And so for every act of aggression and for every aggressive youth, we can think of their aggressive behavior along both the form and the function divide. And so we can conceptualize aggressive behaviors as being both proactively motivated and overt in their form, reactively motivated, overt in their form, etc. And I think it is useful to try to not look at aggression just as aggression, but to take this more nuanced picture of trying to subdivide it and understand it both in terms of the forms it often takes and the functions it's presumably serving. Okay? And if I go too fast, just do feel free to interrupt and stop me. There were, of course, some limits of the meta-analyses, and I certainly want to point out a couple of the more important ones. First, the existing literature and all the literature that went into these meta-analyses is what we call concurrent. Aggression and maladjustment were measured at the same time, which means we have no idea which is causing which. Is it the case that that aggression is leading to maladjustment, which is kind of the inference I've maybe led us to, but I think it's equally plausible to consider whether maladjustment is leading to aggression. So is it the case that the poor peer relations are causing a kid to behave aggressively rather than it being the aggression causing peers to shy away from this kid? At the moment, there's too little longitudinal research to try to disentangle that direction of effects. So we are in a little bit of a uncertain point in terms of which we think causes which. The other limitation is that it's really difficult, and the field has not done a good job in terms of talking about what these different forms, what these different functions look like across development. Now, I think all of us know, of course, that the aggression of a 4-year-old looks quite different than the aggression of a 14-year-old, right? Well, we haven't done a good job, my field, we haven't done a good job at talking about what these different forms and functions look like at different ages, okay? I have a 2-year-old. I know that it's pretty normative at that age for kids to spaz out and melt down over just about everything. I don't think that's necessarily a problem at age 2, but if she's still doing it at age 12, that might be a problem. Of course, then we've hit the adolescent period and we're right back there, right? I think it's also important not to limit ourselves just to the forms and functions I've described. There's some emergent research looking at some other forms, most notably cyberbullying, which is kind of this latest addition to the bullying arsenal. This is aggression that's enacted via technology, cell phones, technology, the social networking sites or email, other internet sort of forms. We as researchers have done very, very little in studying this. Now, presumably this is a very different phenomenon than even relational aggression. This is aggression that can occur kind of transcending space, okay? It's aggression that can occur a long ways from the victim. Not really a lot of time constraints on when this can occur. Kids that are cyberbullied, that are the victims of this, tend to be much more worried throughout the day about what's going on. Okay, if I'm a kid who's being victimized at school, at least I know when I get home that's a safe space and a safe time. If it's a victim of cyberbullying, it may not be a safe space or time. I think we need to consider other functions. For instance, there's a lot of gray area between proactive and reactive aggression. What do we do when we experience individuals who are enacting defensive aggression, but it's very thought through? Now, is that reactive or is that proactive? That falls into a gray area. I want to just, in the interest of time to allow discussion, skip ahead to just make a couple more points before I conclude. In my research in the field, there's a question, what about the victims? Now, I haven't done the meta-analyses from the victim side of things because the literature isn't quite as well developed. But from what I see is that there are distinct victims of overt and relational aggression. This tends to be more highly correlated even than the aggressive overlap between these. And the adjustment correlates tend to look similar. Now, this is just with eyeball looks, and certainly a meta-analysis of that field is where my colleagues and I plan to go next. Also, what about the functions and the implications that has for the victims? Now, it may or may not matter in terms of, for the victim's end, whether the aggression is proactive or reactive. If I'm being victimized, do I really care why the aggressor is doing it? Okay? We don't know. But I think it's probable that there are very different risk factors for being victimized for proactive versus reactive means. Now, in terms of recommendations, assessment, I want to encourage you and those who you supervise to, when you're working with kids who are having problems for aggression, look for all types. Let's not only focus on overt forms that are the most obvious, but we need to look at the relational forms. And we also need to ask the question of why the aggression is occurring. Okay? I think it's important to get multiple informants. So I might not be, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but obviously there's limits to what we can obtain only from talking with a child in the early adolescent. And I think it's important to ask about involvement in aggression whenever there are associated risk factors. These are highly prevalent. Okay, again, not a majority of kids are involved, but a lot more than we might have expected. So if we see a kid that's involved with other types of externalizing problems, it should say on the slide, I think we need to explicitly ask about involvement in aggression. When we see a kid with internalizing problems, unexplained somatic problems, or school avoidance, I think it should be routine to ask if that kid is being victimized. Okay? Now, the treatment, I feel like maybe I should just skip this because it's a very discouraging picture. I will add that I think it is important to understand the forms in order to, if you will, contextualize the treatment. What's actually going on in the aggression? But I think if we're going to make the distinction, what's probably even more critical to make when we're working with the aggressors is in terms of the functions. Now, I've talked about the different underlying social cognitions for reactive and proactive aggression, and certainly those are avenues in for a cognitive or cognitive behavioral intervention. I do also think that if we're treating reactive aggression, we can rely more on anger management, traditional anger management strategies. And I would also add, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I say this with considerable caution, but with some reactively aggressive kids, if the underlying problem is really about impulsivity or difficulties with emotional dysregulation, then certainly pharmacological treatment would probably be more indicated for a reactively aggressive kid than a proactively aggressive kid. Proactive aggressive kids, I think it's a very difficult treatment situation. Certainly if we were going to intervene, these social cognitions would be the point where we may want to start. For instance, talking about and having the kid evaluate what are some other ways to get similar sorts of rewards through more pro-social or simply assertive methods. But again, these are probably going to be difficult kids to treat because, let's face it, the aggression is somehow being reinforced and is paying off for them. So I think that's a more challenging situation. Okay. A few caveats about treating aggressors. The treatment effectiveness studies have not been very consistent, and they do not show very promising effect sizes. Long and the short of it, treating aggressive kids is very difficult. Okay. And I will also add with that, especially here, the treatments that do exist, many of them involve trying to modify the child's environment, the reinforcement contingencies the child's exposed to, which of course may be difficult in a lot of treatment settings. Okay? In terms of treating the victims, I'll start by simply saying the most widely studied and most empirically justifiable approaches, what are sometimes called whole school approaches. These are very comprehensive systemic approaches that involve things like teacher training, collaborations between parents and school personnel, trying to change peer group norms. They're very school-based. Now, of course, if you're not directly working in the schools, it may be very difficult, if not impossible, to apply. But although they have been critiqued by a lot of people in my field, I do think there are some promising individual-focused interventions for the victims. Now, certainly if we can conclude that the victimization is being driven by certain risk factors, such as internalizing problems, deficits in social skills, then intervening with those risk factors may help to alleviate the victimization. Now, an alternative, or I should say complementary approach, would certainly be, to the extent possible, to encourage the collaboration of parents and, if possible, school personnel. Now, one of the things we face with victims is they're often very hesitant to report their victimization to adults, especially school personnel. I've listed some statistics at the bottom of the slide, but basically it's only about half of elementary school kids, and it drops off dramatically as you get to high school. Most kids do not report their victimization because they think adults either can't help or potentially that would make the situation even worse. Well, that's not the case, and we need to encourage kids to tell and enlist the help of adults. Okay? Now, I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. And in fact, I think I've made my points of the final thoughts, so let me just go right to thanking you for your attention and your patience. This went about 5 or 10 minutes longer than I thought, so I apologize for that. And let me go ahead and open it up to either questions, comments, or any points of clarification you want to make, including our people at Keno and anyone else who might be on the other line, if you will.